want to introduce tonight Mike Baker. He's been a minister for over 26 years. For the past 2 years, he's been the pulpit minister at the Concord Street Church of Christ in Orlando, Florida. He has ministered with churches in Kentucky, Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, Texas, and Florida. Prior to preaching, Mike had a 12-year career with North Telecom. He met his wife while they were both students at Freed Hardeman, and they married in 1983. Well, 1893, but 1983. These are young people. They have twin boys, twin sons, Jonathan and Joseph, who are now 28 and reside in Nashville, Tennessee. After 3 years at Freed Hardeman, Mike completed a BBA degree in management from Georgia State University and then received a BA in Bible from Heritage College University before entering to Freed Hardeman as a Master of Ministry degree. Mike has a passion for restoration movement, history, and loves to teach on the history and the future of the church in the United States. He has written for several Brotherhood periodicals and has appeared on several lectureships. Mike?
Thank you, Charlie. Hey, good evening. Good to see all of you here tonight. I understand that a lot of people have left the country because I was speaking tonight. I don't know really how to take that. This is the first time that's ever happened to me, that people have actually left the country. I'm not even a politician, so I don't know how I'm supposed to react to people that leave the country when they hear that I'm coming. But for those of you that are here, I am so happy to be with you again. My wife was with me last year. She's visiting with her mother up in Mount Sterling, Kentucky. Jim and Sharon Willis are from their home church up there, and of course they're not here. See, they heard I was coming. They left and went out west. And but good dear friends, and so my wife sends you greetings because she was here last year and remembers the friendliness that you showed. And so as we start tonight, I want you to get your devices or your Bibles, either one, and let's turn to Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11. I really love it when people bring their Bibles, and of course all the Bibles are on the phones anymore as well, and that's a great thing. I'm trying to be adaptable. I mean, I'm pretty good on social media. We do some things with Facebook and with our sermons and things along that line with the church, and I try to do the best I can with keeping up, but I just can't get used to reading the Bible on my phone. Now, my wife does it a lot because she can make the letters larger, which is good for all of us, but there's just something about it when I go to highlight or underline, it's not the same. You could do that electronically, but it's just not the same. So for me, when I've got a Bible and when I've got it marked up, it just feels like an old companion. And so when you turn to a certain passage and you see some notes or a highlight or an underline, it just gives you a good feeling to say, hey, I've been here before. What can I learn new this time? And that's one of the things. I really appreciate the theme on the great chapters of the Bible. And as you go through life, you're going to hear a lot of the same lessons over and over. A lot of the same lessons over and over. Out of all the Bible stories in the Bible, what do you think, or from your experience, which stories or which character of the Bible, other than Jesus, have you heard the most stories about, do you think? David? Solomon. Paul? Solomon? Okay. Apostle Paul? Okay. And so when you start to hear these stories, right, if a speaker comes up and they're going to talk about the Apostle Paul, and they say, let's turn to hear about him on the road to Damascus, and you think, I've already heard that 100 times. Part of the wonderful thing about Bible study is, if you're open to learning, every time you open your Bible to a certain passage, and if you focus your mind on learning something new when you go to that passage, you will learn something new. I almost guarantee it. Almost, because I can't guarantee it. But every time I go to a passage someone else is teaching, or if I'm studying it again, there's going to be a word, a phrase, or something that comes in that causes me to see that that's new. Now, I had a whole series on the heroes of faith back at Concord Street a few months ago, and that's available on our webpage. And so we went through the major characters of Hebrews chapter 11, and I think there were 8 different lessons that went along with that. And then last Sunday night, I did a lesson that was focused on just the last part, where it says, what more shall I say? For time would fail me to talk of, and it starts to talk about Gideon and Barak and some others that were there. So last Sunday night, we focused just on those at the end. So there's a lot of material in Hebrews chapter 11, more material than we could adequately cover for tonight, but we're going to give it a shot, okay? We're going to give it a shot. As we start, let's begin with this part. And I got to tell you, the light helps, but my eyes are not as good as they used to be. It's a little dark in here, so if I stumble through the words, you just know I'm struggling some with the reading. Most of you in here probably don't know, but there's an app now that's going around on social media that can show you what you look like when you're old. Who comes up with stuff like that? I mean, it's going to happen soon enough when you wake up and go in to brush your teeth and say, "Who are you?" I tried it once and I got rid of it. It is not good. And so I just hope that, I mean, Charlie said I was married in 1893, and so I hope I look this good after 100 years of marriage. But anyway, so I'm struggling a little bit, but let's look at Hebrews chapter 1. But now, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. For by it the elders obtained a good testimony. By faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, and that the things which are seen were not made of things which are visible. Now, my lesson for Sunday morning is going to be simply called Believe. This week, the whole nation and the whole world is focused on 50 years since Apollo 11 went up and we actually set foot on the moon. I mean, just a tremendous accomplishment. At the time, I was up in, Brewston, Tennessee is where my dad was preaching at the time. And so I'm sure I sat down with the family, we watched these things, and of course I've watched them a lot more over the time. But there are people today that don't believe that we went to the moon. There are people today that believe that the earth is still flat. There are people today that refuse to believe things that you and I have experienced, we saw, we witnessed, and we have believed and held those beliefs for a long time. So why is it that some people, in the face of all this evidence, would say that I don't believe that happens? Well, it's kind of human nature in a way, right? Do you recall in John chapter 11, the shortest verse in the Bible is from John chapter 11. Which verse is it? 35. And what does it say? Jesus wept. It's the first memory verse that any student always memorizes. Rejoice evermore, and Jesus wept. Both of those are just real quick verses to do. But who was it that was raised from the dead in John chapter 11? Lazarus. And do you know when Lazarus was raised from the dead, the people that were there with Martha and Mary to help them to mourn, they saw this. And how long had Lazarus been dead? Do you recall? 4 days. 4 days in the grave. And so by that time, everyone was convinced he's really dead. He's not just swooned. He's not going to come back to life at all. So Jesus calls him out of the grave. Some of the people that were there with Martha and Mary, they saw Lazarus come out of the grave. They knew it was true. They saw it with their own two eyes. They had testimony about it. Some of those people, they believed Jesus, meaning that they started to follow Jesus. Others, they believed Jesus, but guess where they went? They went to tell the Pharisees what had happened. You see, even when Jesus was doing great things as he's causing people to be healed, many times they would say, "Hey, we caught you, Jesus, because you did this on the Sabbath day." And so they were always attacking Jesus. And there were people that saw the miracles of Jesus, and yet they didn't follow him. Yet they did not believe him. They didn't follow through with that. John chapter 12 says, many of those people, they believed on Jesus, but because the Pharisees, they did not confess him, for they loved the praise of men more than the praise of God. And so there are always going to be skeptics, always going to be people that do not believe that things happen. I believe that the moonshot happened. I believe that Neil Armstrong and who was the other one? Buzz Aldrin, was it, that set foot on the moon? And I believe that happened. I really do. By the way, if I was around Buzz, I would not say something bad to Buzz. Have you seen him? Buzz Aldrin? Somebody said something he didn't like, and he just turned around and decked him with a fist. And so I don't know how old he is. He's older than me, but he's still got it. So here it says, by faith, we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God. Were you here when the world was created? No, I wasn't either. But why do we believe that God created the world? Because we do it by faith. We do it by understanding what God has revealed to us. Deuteronomy 29:29 says that the secret things belong to the Lord, but the things that He's revealed to us belong to us and to all of our generations. And so God has revealed these things to us. The whole Gospel of John is about people believing. John chapter 17, Jesus has 3 different sections there. The first section, Jesus talks about the unity that He has with the Father. And in the second section, He talks about the unity that He has with His disciples. And in the third chapter of 17, which is all a long prayer, He's praying to God, thanking Him, and looking into the future for the people like us who would believe on Jesus, not having seen this, but based on the testimony of others. As a matter of fact, the whole theme of John is summed up in John chapter 20, verses 30 and 31, where it says, many other signs, that is miracles, Jesus did in the presence of His disciples, which are not recorded in this gospel, but these are recorded so that you may believe. And so we believe that these things happen, not because we were there, not because we had a close relative that said that they saw it firsthand, but because we trust the Bible and the witnesses that have come forth in the Bible to say this. So it's by faith that we understand and we believe that the world was created as it was. So we have several people listed here. By faith, Abel offered to God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain. And what happened to Abel, by the way? Yeah, he was killed by Cain because of that. By Enoch was taken away so that he did not see death. And this was a wonderful thing that was there for him, for his show of faith. But let's get into Noah. All right, by faith, Noah, divinely warned of things not seen, moved with godly fear, prepared an ark for the saving of his household, by which he condemned the world and became the heir of righteousness, which is according to faith. Noah was a pretty old fella. You know, Noah was up into his 600s, right? I believe that was about right. In the year of the flood, the oldest man alive died sometime during that year. What was the man's name? Methuselah. Do you know how old he was? 969 years. Okay, we're not told if he died in the flood or if he died before. We don't know. If he died during the flood, what does that mean about his standing before God? It wasn't good, right, if he died before the flood. But here we have Noah, for about 120 years, takes on this job to build this entire ark. Now, I don't know if you've been up to northern Kentucky or not in your travels, but there's a fellow up there who built a replica of Noah's ark. Now, it's not a replica in every sense exactly as the Bible would say. There are a few things not quite right, but it is the length and the width and the height. And it's marvelous to look at. Now, Carl and I went up there about a year or so ago, and it was a real experience to go through that ark. Because I've heard skeptics for years talk about, oh, it's impossible. You couldn't get all the animals of the earth in one vessel. Well, once you go through this vessel, you begin to understand we're not talking about taking all the animals. We're talking about taking what? Yeah, a male and a female of each kind. But not only that, if they were clean animals, how many? By sevens, right. 7 pairs instead of 1 pair. So you think about all this and about how they would feed them and how they would take care of them. And here God was, and this wasn't an overnight project. This took 120 years. Now, Noah wasn't just a single vocational guy building that. He wasn't just a contractor, but he also was a preacher of righteousness. So he's still telling the people the whole time that things are going to be bad and it's going to come a flood. Up until that time, we have no evidence that it even rained upon the earth. Up until that time, there was a canopy that covered the earth, a water vapor, and it was like a terrarium, we're told. Okay, do you remember terrariums? They're like an aquarium without the fish, right? You take the aquarium thing and you put some vegetation in it and a little water and maybe some insects, and then you cap it off, and it becomes its own ecosystem. Well, that's kind of how the earth was. Can you imagine all the ridicule that Noah went through as he's going through, cutting down this timber, bringing it in, processing it, getting it put up in this huge boat as he's going through. But then that one day came, of course, when God says, Noah, it's time. And all those animals proceeded to come on up, and they came up, and then God shut the door, and here the heavens opened up, the rains came down, the floods came up, and you know about how that boat floated. All of the people of the earth at that time, they knew that there was a God, didn't they? But it was too late for them at that point. Noah now, he was pretty old. How old is it before you can be used for God? How old is too old? Are we ever too old to speak a good word for Jesus? No, we're never too old to do that. We can always be of use to Jesus, and so we need to think on that as we learn from Noah in this sense. Noah also, he stood out in a crowd, didn't he? And he did something that had never been done before. Okay? He did something that had never been done before. There are times in our lives that we see people that just take on foolish things, and they go to do things that just don't seem logical. But there are other people that are people of vision. And those people of vision, they see what can be done, and despite all the critics, they hold to their path until they get that done. Here's Noah with all of his critics, and he holds to his path of faithfulness, and he wants to do exactly what God wanted him to do. Let's go on now and talk about Abraham. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he dwelt in a land of promise, as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. Now, for he waited for a city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. His wife Sarah, listed here also. By faith, Sarah herself also received strength to conceive seed, and she bore a child, and she was past the age, but because she judged him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born as many as the stars of the skies of the multitude, innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. Now here we have Abraham. Now Abraham's pretty old when God first gets in touch with him. About 75 years old or so, I believe. And he's 100 years old when Isaac is born. Now, during that time, Abraham had a lot of different journeys that he went on. You know the story of Abraham. You know how he went, and sometimes he would go into a country, and he was fearful because his wife was beautiful, and he was fearful that the king might desire to have his wife and to kill him to take his wife. And so do you remember what Abraham said about Sarah? What did he say about her? Yeah, she's my sister. She's my sister. So Abraham had some trouble trying to focus and fully have faith in God every step of the way, because there were opportunities where he thought he needed to help God out, that God wasn't going to protect him in that journey. And so he lied, and that wasn't good. He was trying to improve God's plan. There was a time at which that Abraham himself was kind of laughing about a situation with Sarah, with the possibility of her having a son. Sarah herself was caught laughing out loud. And during the time that they were waiting, and here are several years that they're waiting for this thing to happen, for Isaac to be born, Sarah comes up with an idea, but it wasn't the first idea they had. There were two different ideas that Sarah and Abraham had to try to help God out so that they could have a son. Do you recall what the first one was? There was a servant that they had. And they said, why don't you just take this servant and have him to become your heir? And God said, that's not going to happen. And then the second is the more familiar solution that we had. And what was that solution? Sarah offered something. Yeah, Sarah offered her handmaid, and she said, well, let's do this. I'll let you have her, and that can be your other wife, and then you can have a child by her, and that will help. Because look, Abraham, we're not getting any what? Any younger. You know, that doesn't just apply to old people. That applies to everybody. Everybody's getting older all the time. So here Abraham and Sarah are, and they're both listed in the heroes of faith here. And what are they doing? Abraham's lying some, and then they can't see themselves clear to see that God's plan is going to work out. And so what can we learn from this? Well, I can tell you one thing I can learn. I'm not going to be perfect in my walk of faith. There are going to be some times where I have faith doubts of faith in my life and in your life. And so as they were going along, they tried to help God out, and it didn't work out. Of course, Isaac and Ishmael were separated, and their descendants were warring with each other for years and years. Later on, it talks about Abraham again, when Abraham took Isaac up on the mountain for a sacrifice. You remember that story, don't you? Okay, so Isaac at this point, he's probably a young man, maybe a teenager, something along that line. So if Abraham was 100 when he had him, he's going to be 115, maybe, let's just put a peg on that and just think about that. So Abraham's 115, climbing a mountain. And he's got Isaac with him along with the servants, and they got all the supplies that they need. They get to a certain point, and Abraham tells the servants, well, y'all can stay here. The boy and I, we're going to go on up. And so they go on up, and as they're preparing the altar for sacrifice, Isaac looks around and he says, "Where is the sacrifice that we're going to give?" Do you remember what Abraham's answer was? The Lord will provide. God will provide, right? Now there's a sense of faith here. Here's a man who's gone through all these years. He left his homeland not knowing where he was going to go. He came out of a land of polygamy, worshiping various gods. And so all these things have been sorting out through his life. Now he knows who God is. He's known as a man of faith, and he's made these mistakes along life's journeys. Now he's got the only son of promise, Isaac. And now he's already grown to where he's soon to be out on his own, and through this son, all these nations are going to be populated. So there's a very logical reason why Abraham should not sacrifice Isaac. But he's to the point now in his faith journey with God that guess what? He binds up Isaac and he puts him on the altar. And he takes the knife out to slay him. And he reaches the knife back and he's about ready to come down, and what happens? The Lord stops his hand. And then here's the sacrifice caught in the bush. Now, if you're Isaac, what are you thinking? I'm thinking the old man's lost it. That's what I'm thinking, probably, right? Right? First of all, I'm not going to be alone with you anymore. I want those helpers with us because I need some eyewitnesses what's going on. You know, old man, you're going in a home pretty soon as we get off this mountain. No, you've got to understand this is part of God's plan. This is part of how God was expressing himself. And through these challenges, through these trials, see, God could have said to Abraham, Abraham, this is going to be so wonderful and so perfect. It's going to be just like it was yesterday. You're going to wake up in 10 months and you're going to have a son. And even at that, he might have been impatient, but instead it was over 10 years. And so you think he's already been patient. He's already been out on the road. He's already left everything he had. But he grows in his faith to the extent that he could be willing to kill his only son. Now, Genesis doesn't talk about this, but the Hebrew writer does. In Hebrews chapter 11, he says that Abraham knew that even if he slew his son, what would happen? God would bring him back to life. And you know how he knew that? Because he was as good as dead biologically when God created this son from him and Sarah. So he had faith in that, and that faith spilled out also to know if God tells me to do this, God will do something to make it right. Now that's faith, isn't it? That is real faith. My wife and I were over at Holly Hill in Daytona a couple of weeks ago, and you know, anytime you start to go over these big bridges, I don't know about you, but I get a little bit nervous. I get a lot nervous if somebody else is driving, but if it's just me, I get a little bit nervous. And so you start to think about these bridges, and I've seen some pictures of the really big bridges. I haven't been on any of those yet, but the really big ones, you know, where they go almost straight up in the air, and you start thinking, I've got to really trust that every link of that bridge is in place when I go over. Because when I get to the pinnacle of that bridge and start to come over, I don't even see what's on the other side yet. I've got to trust that when I drive that car over, just like all the cars in front of me, that there's going to be another side of the bridge and let me safely on this other side. We take for granted that there's always a stretch of road in front of us all the time. In Florida, we have a lot of hard rains. You turn the wipers on, then you turn the wipers on hard, and then you keep going because, you know, at least guys, because we're guys. You know, we got to get to where we're going. And our wives are saying, you can't see. Well, I don't have to see. I know the road's straight here, right? And so you trust that everything is good. But I got to tell you, in our faith journey, there are times that we really are stretched to trust that next phase of our life is going to be in place for that. Because just with Abraham, as he's offering Isaac up, you got to think, all right, Abraham's gone through all of this, and he's really, really old from our standpoint, and he's thinking, why is God asking me to do this? But unlike when he was younger, he doesn't argue this time. He's willing to go through with what God says. God can prove us in with these challenges in our life to the extent that we know what's going on. Now, Moses is another one that's listed here. And Moses is one, when he was born, He was hidden 3 months by his parents because he was a beautiful child and they were not afraid of the king's command. And when he became of age, he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked for reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. And by faith he kept the Passover. All these things, what he said. By faith they passed through the Red Sea as dry land, and the Egyptians passed through and they died. Well, what do we learn about Moses? Well, he didn't want to be called Pharaoh's daughter, but when he was 40 years old, there were 3 different sections of Moses' life, and they were all 40 years. Okay, he was 120 years old when he died, and he was still in pretty good shape. He died before they went over into the Promised Land. So after the end of the 40 years, what happened to cause Moses to leave Egypt and to go away? He killed an Egyptian. Yeah, he killed an Egyptian, and then he said, I did it, right? He fessed up and went to the authorities and told, is that what he did? No, what did he do with the body? He buried it, and he thought he got away with it, and the next day some people said, hey, you're that one that killed this Egyptian. So he fled. He fled. So for 40 years now, Moses is living a pretty serene life. I mean, it's not like Pharaoh's palace, but he's out there, and he's got Jethro. And what is Jethro to Moses? His father-in-law, and so he's got his wife and his father-in-law, and lots of livestock and lots of good things. He's doing all right. And then one day, he comes upon this burning bush, and God starts to talk to him and tell him, I've got a job for you. Now, how old is Moses when God engages him to go back into Egypt? 80 years old. 80 years old. And Moses, he didn't want to do it. He didn't want the job. Have you ever had a job offered to you that you didn't want? Yeah, sometimes it happens like that. It's like tonight, 3 or 4 guys being asked, do you want to lead songs? No. Do you want to lead songs? No. Yeah. Hey, listen, there are some jobs you just don't want, right? But here's a job that Moses is being offered. Moses, I want you to go in and I want you to go back to Pharaoh, and I want you to get up in his face and I want you to tell him to let my people go. Moses is he's a murderer on the run. What do you think is going to happen to a murderer on the run when he goes back into Egypt? And so Moses concocts all these different excuses. And he says, I'm not going to do it. I can't do it. I want you to get somebody else. He says, well, what happens if they ask me who sent me? And God's answer was what? Tell them, I am sent you. And what happens if they won't believe me? And so God says, what is that in your hand? And what was it? A staff or a rod? And he said to do what with it? Throw it on the ground. And what happened to it? I couldn't do that job. I could throw it down and turn it on a stake. I couldn't do the next step. What was the next step? Pick it up by the tail. No, sirree. No, sirree. See, when God challenges me with that, we're going to stretch this faith all the way out. Because it's one of those things. I was teaching on John 13 last Sunday. And in John chapter 13, there's the foot washing. Jesus washes the disciples' feet. And I'll ask you, has anybody ever been to a foot washing service? Okay, all right. It's about the same number. 1 or 2 people have been to foot washing. And they asked me if I'd ever been to one. I said, I've never been to a foot washing service. Never been to a snake handling service either. It's just probably not going to happen. But here's Moses, right? He reaches down, picks up the tail of the snake, it turns back into a staff or a rod. He goes into Pharaoh, and he does this trick with Pharaoh, and guess what Pharaoh's magicians do? They all throw their staffs down, and they all became snakes. Well, then Moses' snake ate them up. I would have to be told that because I'd be outside. You put all these snakes on the ground, I'm not going to be around that. But Moses endures through all this. And guess what else Moses does? Now, he's here in this Heroes of Faith chapter. Moses has this wonderful experience of knowing that God is behind him. And even though Pharaoh's heart is becoming hardened every time he goes to him, and he almost gets this, and then Pharaoh pulls it back, God comes with another plague. How many plagues were there? a total of 10 plagues as he goes, and each plague got progressively worse, and then they finally got to the last plague, which was what? Death of the firstborn. That's where we have the blood over the doorpost, and that's where the Passover comes, because death was going to pass over those houses. And so they would be spared, but from Pharaoh on down, the firstborn of all of the land died. And so in all the grief that was going on, Moses said, now is the time. They were all prepared, they all left, and everybody's happy. And they're escaping Egypt, they're escaping Pharaoh, and they get all the way to the edge of the Red Sea, and guess what? What are we doing out here, Moses? Why have you brought us all the way out here? Don't you see Pharaoh's army coming? And so Moses, he's able to, with God's help then, to part the Red Sea. The Red Sea opens up and it says dry land, and so they all go across, over 1 million people, they all go across, and Pharaoh's army is hot in pursuit, and what happens then? The waters come back down and they drown them all. Now you would think that a group of people like that would be so grateful to God that God had delivered them out of the hands of their masters. They were all slaves before in a land of idol worship, and now they were being shown exactly who the true God is. You would think that they would be very, very focused on following this God. And they did for a little while. And then they complained. And then something else would happen. And then they would have to be reminded again of all the good things that God did. And here was the thing. You know, they've come out of this land of promise. God sent all these plagues. God was able to have the Red Sea open and close and give them safe passage and kill their enemies. God is ready to give them the land of promise. All they have to do is go out and confirm what God said was true, come back and say, we believe God, and they could have gone right on into the land of promise. They chose 12 different people. You only know the name of 2 of them. Which 2 do you know? Joshua and Caleb, right? I've got a friend of mine used to preach up in Murray, Kentucky, John Dale. And he's the only preacher I've ever known that used the names of the other 10. And he would begin a lesson, he would rattle off these names, and he says, you know who they are, don't you? You hear crickets chirping, you know, nobody knows. And he says, you know, that's just as well that we don't remember their names, because they were the evil spies. Those 12 went into the land of promise. God told them exactly what to look for. They were able to go in and safely come back. They came back with some of the spoils of the country, showed all the goodness that was there, the vegetation, the food that they brought back. They said everything that God said is there. We believe that everything God said was true, but we don't have the faith to go in. We don't have the faith to confront them because we're fearful. They're tall, they're giants in our sight, and we feel like what? Grasshoppers. Okay? It's a grasshopper complex. And here's the thing. All this that God had shown them, all the evidence that was laid out in front of them, and yet they were afraid to go forward because they didn't trust God. Can you imagine that, not trusting God? You go 70 miles an hour in the driving rain over a bridge to which you can't see the other side of the bridge. You trust that bridge is going to be there. But sometimes we can't trust that God is going to keep His promises. Well, what happens is instead of going into the land of promise right away and having Moses to set up shop and being able to sort everybody out to their tribal areas, for 40 years they wander in the wilderness. Now, how old is Moses when God says it's time for him to leave? He's 120 years old. His eyesight is not dimmed, and he's still in good shape. But it's time now for Joshua to take the reins. And so here Moses is. Now, what was the reason why Moses couldn't go into the land of promise? He struck a rock, but God said for him to strike a rock. Not that time. That's right. God did say for him to strike a rock before. This time He said to do what to the rock? Just to speak to the rock. And you know what else He did? Not only did He do that, but his speech put himself up on the level with God. Must we provide water from this rock for you, you ungrateful people? And so that was as much as the deliberate disobedience to God. And we might feel like the punishment for Moses was a bit harsh, that Moses couldn't go into the land of promise. God took him up on the mountain so he could look over and see the land of promise, but he couldn't go into it himself. But you know what? Moses ended his life right with God. And so as good as that land of promise was here, what he saw after he died was much, much better. And so in this land of wonderful promise, we saw Moses, and one of the lessons is don't go beyond what God has said for us to do. I'm thinking about not going beyond. Is that clock right? So I've got 7:10, all right? Now, you know, one of the things about substitute speakers is like substitute teachers. I never give an exam. Aren't you glad? Okay? And I always try to let you out early. Aren't you glad about that too? I found that if you do those two things, people like to have you back. So that's good. Now, there are a couple other people here. Let's talk about Ruth just for a little bit. No. I'm trying to look at different things that I've got going on. Let's go on into this last section. We've got Rahab. All right. What was Rahab? What do you know about Rahab as a woman? She was a harlot. She received the spies. She believed that their God was the true God. She harbored them in. She was able to signify for her and her family by the thread that they were to be spared. So when Jericho was taken, and who was leading God's army when Jericho was taken? Wasn't Moses? Joshua. Okay, and do you remember there what was peculiar about taking Jericho? It was a 3-hour campaign, right? What was it? Yeah, 7 days. So they march around one time the first day, and the second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth. And how many times on the last day? 7 times. And they weren't supposed to say a word through any of this. Okay? Boy, if God gave us one of those things to do, we would really be in trouble, wouldn't He? If God said, all right, here's the only thing that you could do to be right with me to go to heaven, and that is, you need to come to worship, and here's going to be a song, but you can't sing, and you can't hum, and you can't think of the words, and for a whole hour, you have to sit still and not say a word. That's hard to do. That's hard to do. Yeah, it really is. Well, they weren't supposed to say a word as they're going through. What do you think the guys up on the wall are saying at them as they're walking around Jericho? Yeah, all these catcalls, insults, things. What is up with you and your God that you're going to be doing those things? But when the time came, and when the trumpet sounded, and when the shout was there, what happened to the walls of Jericho? They all fell. Because the might of all the men pushing on those stone walls and all the strength training that they went through, it wasn't that. It was God. It was God. Have you noticed that God wants us to know that it's not about us as much as it is about Him? Do you know in the very next campaign, Joshua was feeling pretty good about going into the land of promise. After all, they've waited 40 years to get there. Surely the people have learned their lesson. Surely they're going to be obedient to God. Surely God is going to give us every city without any type of problem. So when they went into the next city of Ai, that's Ai, Joshua said, we don't even need to take a whole contingent of the army. We'll just send a few hundred men out to do it. And as they went out, guess what happened? They got thrown. They were chased out of Ai, and they came back. And here's the problem. Through all the things that God's people have gone through, God had told them when they go into Jericho to destroy the whole city and not take any spoils from the city. You know what spoils of war are, right? That's when you go in, you find the loot, the gold, the animals, whatever, you can take it back. And all throughout the Bible, we find people that had trouble with that. You know, Saul spared King Agag. And here are some other problems. And here we found this fellow by the name of Achan. And Achan had gone on that campaign into Jericho, but he had found some things of value, and so he hid them and came back and put them under his tent. That's why the men at Ai were losing the battle, because there was sin in the camp. See, God is always teaching us these lessons about trusting Him, following His commands, and being faithful to follow Him all the way through. Now with Abraham tried to help God along, right? Because he's getting impatient. And so he tried to lie at one point, tried to get 2 other alternatives to Isaac before Isaac came. But by the time he was tested in the end, he was ready to sacrifice Isaac, because now he had proven in his faith and he knew that he could be faithful and that God was going to be faithful to him. So in this next section then, what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon and of Barak and of Samson and of Jephthah and of David and Samuel and the prophets. Now, of all these men and what they went through, there was a tremendous amount of challenge for them. For example, when we talk about Gideon, we first find out about Gideon, and Gideon is more or less a coward. He's hiding. He's hiding from those that are around him. And so that's not good. That's not good. Gideon is hiding from those that are around him. But God takes Gideon and makes a mighty warrior out of him. He starts with 32,000 troops. 32,000 troops. And how much does God cut him down to? 300. From 32,000 down to 300. And so he takes this man who formerly was a coward, and he makes him a mighty man of valor and of war. And then he takes this tremendous army and he cuts it down to only 300 people. And then he tells him what to do. He takes those 300 people, he splits them up, he surrounds the enemy, and he wins the battle. But he wins the battle by showing that it wasn't Gideon, it was what? It was God. We find that in Judges 6 and 7. Barak is listed in Judges chapter 5. And so in Judges chapter 5, we find out about Barak. He's a commander of the army. He's not the most brave person that you're going to encounter. He's not gung-ho. And so what happens is he has to be convinced by Deborah to be able to go into battle. As a matter of fact, he's not willing to go into battle unless Deborah is going with him. And so Barak goes, and Deborah is there as well, and they chase the king out, and he's not even able to kill the king, because the king escapes, goes into the tent where he thinks he's going to be safe, and when he goes to sleep, do you know what happens to the king? They take a tent peg and put it through his temple. Boy, there are a lot of innovative ways to get rid of people in the Bible, aren't there? Well, Barak is listed there as well. What makes him so good about faith? Well, he struggled with things, but he set out to do it, and he trusted God, and God showed through that battle that he was in charge. Samson is found in Judges 13 through 16. And we find Samson because he was a man of great strength. And where was his strength located? In his hair. And so he had a wife, and then that worked out, and then Delilah later wasn't his wife, and so he keeps dabbling with temptation all the time with temptation, and he just can't leave it alone. And so women are one of the short downfalls of him, and eventually he fesses up and he tells Deborah that his strength is found in his hair. Because before they say, well, if you bind me up this way or bind me up that way, then my strength will be gone. And it was all a ruse, because when they bound him up, he just broke out of those bindings and he killed the people around. But this time they cut his hair off. Who cut his hair? Not Delilah. Not Delilah. The Philistines came in and cut his hair. I got another lesson on that. I tell you, I tried about things that you think you know that you don't know, and we started going through a list of things, and just like you say Delilah, and I was like, no, this one. By about the third question, nobody answered. Everybody was afraid to answer. It's like, I'm not answering any more questions. But here's the thing: study your Bible, learn the Bible. So here, from weakness came strength. Now, in this next section, we're not going to have time to get into all that, but of all the things that these people of faith suffered, through weakness they were made strong. Well, guess what? Well, the weakness here would be like with Samson. His hair was gone, he was weak, his eyes were gouged out, but he became strong again because his hair was growing again. So it was said in death that he killed more people in death than when he was alive, because he was able to push the pillars out. The roof came down and collapsed on all the people there. Jephthah is another one listed. He's found in Judges 11 and 12. And here was one of the things about Jephthah. Sometimes we think, well, we have to have a really good start in life, else we won't be successful. We have to come from a good family. Maybe we have to come from, wealth, and we have to have all these good things. Well, he was the son of a prostitute, and so his brothers cast him out. He wasn't accepted at all until his time came, and then he was elevated up as one of the judges, and he comes into this battle, and he was able to conquer this battle over the Ammonites with what he was doing. David, of course, is listed, and there's so much that David did. So much that David did. He was a man after what? Man after God's own heart. That means that he was perfect in everything he did, right? No, he wasn't. You know, David is one of the 3 or 4 people that you said that you've heard more lessons about than anybody else. You know, God didn't let David build the temple because of something wrong with his hands. What was wrong with his hands? They were bloody from all the people he had killed. And of all the nights that David sat out there with his sheep and looked up into the heavens and saw all the wonders of that, and all the times that we read in the Psalms of how close David is and how he trusted in him, and all the times that he was escaping from Saul and he was saying all these songs of deliverance as he was delivered, and he knew that God was teaching him all these ways. After all of those times of knowing that God is there with him, and by the way, while he's a shepherd, he killed 2 different types of beasts. What were they? A lion and a bear, and that gave him the real courage to know that God was with him when he killed who? Goliath, okay? So he's got all this going for him. And now he's become king. Saul's gone, he becomes king. It's good to be king. Everything's good. He's got multiple wives. He's got everything he's got going. He should have been out at war in the springtime, and instead, where is he? He's up on his rooftop, and he looks over. Who does he see? Bathsheba. And what was she doing? Isn't that odd? Her name is Bathsheba. She was taken. It's almost like people named somebody after they did something, right? Like her name was Gloria before, but now it's Bathsheba because we'll never remember that Gloria was taking a bath. But Bathsheba will remember that, right? So, hey, what happens with David? All of that good that he built up with God, all the faith that he had with God, all the times that God was with him, stood with him and gave him everything he wanted, and now he's king and he's got everything. I mean, everything he could possibly want. And he wants somebody else's wife. See, humans kind of mess it up, don't we? Humans kind of mess it up. So here's one of the things to learn about David. David's a man after God's own heart. David was blessed by God in so many different ways. David kept messing up. It's not his only time to mess up. He messed up again trying to get Uriah to come on furlough and stay over at his house. He wouldn't do that. So then he arranged for Uriah to be killed. And then he took Bathsheba in. Look at me. I'm such a great guy. This valiant soldier died. I'm going to take his widow in. Anybody got any objections? She gives birth to a son. What happens to the son? He dies. Who was it that let David know that he had done wrong? Nathan. That's another job I don't think anybody would want. You know, Moses didn't want his job of going and doing what he did. Think about Nathan. Here's God. Nathan, I got a job for you. Yes, sir. What do you want me to do? I want you to go to the king, and I want you to get up in his face, and I want you to tell the king that everybody knows that he had an adulterous relationship. His secret is no secret anymore, and that he's going to be punished for it. Nathan's like, where's the sword? Where can I don't want to do this, right? But he goes, and what Nathan does is so wonderful. Because instead of just telling David straight out, what does he do? He tells a parable. And in this parable, David automatically, since he's the king, he's the ultimate lawmaker, he sees the injustice that is there in that parable, and he jumps on it. And before he can really look all the way through the details, he says, this man did wrong, and he's got to make up for it. Nathan comes with that wonderful comeback. You are the man. Oh, wow. 2 Samuel 11 and 12. You get there in 12, and David is just a shell of a man. He has been so decimated by this. The young baby, the boy, falls sick. David fasts, and he prays. He doesn't do anything. Then he hears that the boy has died, and then he gets up, he gets cleaned up, and he wants some food. And then at the end of that chapter, you have that wonderful little passage where he says, my son has died. You know, he's gone on. I can't bring him back, but one day I can go to him. Oh, so much that we can learn from that. But here's another person of great faith. So out of this chapter, when you study it on your own, when you read through it, dwell on these different individuals there, and dwell on this last part, and we don't have time to get into that. It's just about time for us to stop. But here they were. What were they doing? Who through faith? They subdued kingdoms. They worked righteousness. They obtained promises. They stopped the mouth of lions. We have who? Well, we have David for one. Samson killed a lion. Daniel's in the lion's den. They quenched the violence of fire. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego come to mind. They escaped the edge of the sword. Out of weakness they were made strong. There's Samson again. They became valiant in battle, turned to fight the armies of the aliens. The women received back their dead to life again. That's Elisha and Elijah doing that. Others were tortured, not accepting deliverance. That word for torture there means to be stretched out over a barrel and beaten until you die, that they might receive a better inheritance. Others had a trial of mockings and scourgings. Jeremiah was one that was laughed at for that. Others were in chains and in prison. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. They were tempted. They were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains and dens and caves on the earth. And all of these, having obtained a good testimony through faith, did not receive the promise, God having promised something better for us, that they should not be made perfect apart from us. Now, I kind of rushed through that last part. But here's the summary. If God thought enough of these people to memorialize them for all the ages as great examples of faith, and for each of them, they didn't receive all that they thought that they were going to have because God had something better in mind for them, then don't you think that affects us with our faith? There's so many times that I'll sit with people, God, I've got to have this, and I've got to have my health, and I've got to have this relationship, and I've got to have deliverance from this, and it's not wrong for us to ask for any of those things. But we've got to understand too, friends, that at times we don't get everything we ask for, but we still remain faithful to God. Got a friend of mine that's in the hospital now. He's got about 6 months to live. He's praying for a miracle. I'd be praying for a miracle too if I was in that hospital bed, and I'm praying for him. But I know the likelihood of that cancer is it's not going to go all away on its own. The doctors don't think anything they do is going to help him. And there's going to come a transformation in his mind as time goes on, because he's not going to give up on praying for the miracle, but there's going to come a tipping point one day in his prayer life when he's going to realize, just like we sing the song, this world is not my home. I'm just a passing through. Of all the good things that I can enjoy in this life, God has something so much better for me. So much better for me. You see, it's when we understand and fully trust in God through faith that we'll accept whatever comes along in this life as long as we're faithful with God. If any of us are not in a right relationship with God tonight, I want you to not leave here until we have a chance to talk with you. If you've struggled with some aspect of Christianity, we can pray with you as a group. We can pray with you individually and privately. But we want you to know that God loves you, and He doesn't want you ever to go to bed not knowing and not having the assurance that if you died, that you'd be right with Him. If you're here tonight, not yet a New Testament Christian, we'd love to talk with you about that as well. Last year when Carla and I was here, you had a baptism afterwards. We thought it was tremendous. And then you covered up the whole baptistry with a screen so we could see the film of, the camera. And I thought, well, that's great too, because that's a better angle. I'd love to see either one of those things happen if they need to, because we all need to be right with God tonight. If you need to come tonight, come forward while we stand and while we sing.